The night Marcus Calloway answered his door to a stranger, he believed he was doing nothing more than offering a helping hand. He had no idea that by the time the sun came up, another knock on that very same door would bring a man powerful enough to turn his entire life upside down. Outside, the storm was relentless. Rain fell in heavy sheets over the quiet streets of Clover Ridge. The kind of cold, punishing rain that made the world feel empty and far away. Inside the small but tidy house on Birchwood Lane, the lights burned low, and the faint rattle of an aging radiator filled the silence. Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by a pile of overdue notices and a mug of coffee he had long forgotten to drink. In the next room, his 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, slept soundly, her arms wrapped around a worn stuffed elephant she called Peanut. Marcus had been her only parent for nearly 4 years, ever since he lost his wife to illness. Every single day was a quiet war between keeping the bills paid, showing up for Sophie, and carrying the grief that had permanently settled somewhere behind his chest, but he carried it. For her, he always carried it. That night, just as Marcus reached over to switch off the kitchen light, a knock came at the front door. It was faint, almost uncertain, the kind of knock that sounded more like a question than a request. When he opened the door, a young woman stood on the porch, completely soaked through. Her dark hair clung to her face, her jacket was streaked with mud, and her eyes held the particular look of someone who had been frightened for a very long time. She looked like someone running from something she couldn't name. Marcus did not ask for explanations. He simply opened the door wider and stepped aside. Sometimes, a single act of kindness is enough to rewrite everything. Before we continue, if you believe that compassion still has a place in this world, and that one quiet decision can change the course of a life, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this, and subscribe to SIF Stories for more powerful and moving tales just like this one. Your support is what keeps these stories going. The young woman said her name was Kara. She spoke slowly, carefully, as though each word took effort to release. Marcus brought her a dry towel, made a fresh pot of tea, and gave her the only spare blanket in the house. Kara offered very little about herself. She only said she had no place else to go. Marcus did not push her. Life had already shown him that sometimes a person needs warmth long before they need an explanation. That night, Kara slept on the couch while Marcus lay in bed listening to the rain, turning over the unanswered questions in his mind, but choosing, in the end, to leave them there. Morning came gently. Pale light filtered through the curtains, and Sophie's laughter broke the stillness before Marcus had even made it to the kitchen. She had found their guest and was already chatting away without reservation. Kara seemed startled by the little girl's openness. Children have a way of walking right past the walls that adults spend years building. For the first time since arriving, Kara smiled. They ate breakfast together, scrambled eggs and toast, and for a brief stretch of time, the small house felt fuller than it had in years. But ease has a way of ending without warning. Shortly before noon, a black car pulled up outside. Then another, then 2 more. The sleepy street suddenly looked like the backdrop of something entirely out of place. Marcus peered through the curtain and watched as several men in dark tailored suits stepped out with a kind of deliberate calm that came from always being in control. One of them walked toward the front door with the stride of a man who had never once been told to wait. The knock that followed was nothing like the one from the night before. It was firm, certain, commanding. Marcus opened the door. The man standing before him was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with a quiet intensity that seemed to alter the air around him. His eyes swept across Marcus's face and then moved into the house behind him, taking in everything in a matter of seconds. Several guards stood at a respectful distance behind him. When the man spoke, his voice was controlled, measured, and carried the unmistakable weight of someone rarely questioned. He introduced himself as Richard Voss. Even Marcus, who made a habit of avoiding business news, recognized the name. Richard Voss was among the wealthiest and most formidable figures in the country, and he was standing at the door of a small house on Birchwood Lane. What he said next drained the warmth from the room entirely. "My daughter," Richard said, his voice barely restrained, "spent the night in this house." Marcus felt the breath leave him. Behind him, Kara stepped forward. The fear that had briefly left her eyes returned in full. Richard's gaze locked onto her instantly, and the silence between them said more than any words could have. Kara stood still, smaller somehow under that stare, yet she lifted her chin just slightly. "He wants to speak with you," she said to Marcus quietly, her voice carrying the weight of an apology she hadn't yet been able to give. And just like that, everything fell into place. Kara was not simply a frightened young woman from the storm. She was Richard Voss's daughter. The room felt dense with unspoken tension. Richard's eyes traveled slowly across the modest space, the mismatched furniture, the handmade paper decorations Sophie had taped along the walls, the general warmth of a home kept together by effort rather than wealth. He looked at Marcus again, and this time there was something almost like curiosity beneath the suspicion. "Tell me what happened last night," he said. It was not quite a question. Marcus felt something firm settle inside him. He had done nothing wrong, and he had nothing to hide. He told Richard the truth plainly. A frightened young woman had appeared at his door in the middle of a storm. She had looked exhausted and afraid. He had offered her a place to dry off and sleep, nothing more. Richard listened without a word. Kara watched from across the room, and in her expression was something caught between guilt and quiet relief. After a long pause, Richard turned to his daughter. "Is that what happened?" Kara nodded without hesitation. No one spoke for a moment. Then Richard exhaled. Not the exhale of a man containing rage, but the exhale of a father who had spent an entire sleepless night imagining the worst. Kara told him everything then. The argument that had driven her out the night before. The suffocating pressure of living her life as the daughter of one of the most scrutinized men in the country. The way she had walked out of the estate with no destination. Just the need to go somewhere no one knew her name. The rain had caught her miles from home, and Marcus's house had been the only one with a light still burning. Richard looked at Marcus again. Something in his expression had shifted, become less armored. "You took in a stranger with no questions asked," he said quietly. "That is not something I encounter very often." Marcus shrugged simply. It was the right thing to do. Those words seemed to land somewhere unexpected. Then the smallest person in the room changed everything. Sophie padded into the entryway, looked up at Richard Voss without a trace of hesitation, and held up Peanut the stuffed elephant with both hands. She told him with complete sincerity that Peanut was very good at making scared feelings go away. Richard Voss went still, and then, to the surprise of everyone in that room, he laughed. Not a polished or performative laugh, but something genuine and unguarded. The kind that surfaces when a person is caught completely off guard by something real. It seemed to come from a place that had not been visited in a long time. He crouched down, accepted the elephant with both hands, thanked Sophie with a gentleness that did not match his reputation, and handed Peanut carefully back to her. When he stood and faced Marcus again, his voice had changed slightly. "I owe you more than I can say," he said. Shortly after, the long line of black cars pulled away from Birchwood Lane, and the quiet neighborhood exhaled and returned to itself. But the story was far from finished. Weeks went by. Marcus and Sophie returned to their routines. Bills came. Work continued. The house stayed exactly as it had always been, and yet something had quietly shifted. One afternoon, the phone rang. It was Richard Voss's office. Marcus assumed there had been some kind of error. There had not. Richard wanted to meet with him, not to interrogate him, not out of obligation but because he genuinely wanted to. At that meeting, Richard said something Marcus had not expected. That night, he explained, had forced him to look at his daughter's life in a way he had been avoiding for years. In the relentless pursuit of building his empire, he had drifted away from what held any of it together. Marcus, a man with very little by any financial measure, had something Richard had slowly and quietly lost. A home that felt like one, a daughter who was deeply loved, and a way of treating strangers that expected nothing back. Richard offered Marcus a position within his company, one that would change the shape of his financial life entirely. Marcus hesitated. He was not sure he was built for a world of boardrooms and billionaires. Richard's response was simple. "The rarest quality in any leader," he said, "is genuine kindness. And you have more of it than most." Marcus accepted. Not for the money, though the relief it brought was real, but because he had come to understand that sometimes life extends an open door through the most unlikely hands. Kara remained part of their world too. She visited often, sometimes just to sit in the living room that had once given her shelter in the middle of a storm, sometimes simply to watch Sophie color at the kitchen table. And Richard Voss, the man the business world called relentless, found himself returning to that small house on Birchwood Lane as well. Not as a powerful figure with an entourage, but as a father learning, slowly and sincerely, how to simply be present. Now, before we reach the final moment of this story, if something in this journey has stayed with you, please take a second to like the video, share it with someone who still believes in the quiet power of kindness, and subscribe to Sift Stories for more stories that remind us what truly matters. And here is something special to ask of you before the ending. Leave a comment below with the words "Kindness changes destinies," because sometimes the smallest act travels further than we ever thought possible. Years from now, Marcus would still think back to that stormy night in Clover Ridge. The hesitant knock at the door, the young woman standing in the rain, the moment he stepped aside without asking for a reason. He never planned to stand across from one of the most powerful men in the country. He never imagined that one ordinary evening would quietly redirect the course of his life and the lives of everyone connected to it. He only opened his door, and sometimes, that is the whole story. If this moved you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that kindness is never wasted. Stories like this exist because people like you believe they matter. And somewhere tonight, someone might open their door to a stranger, and without knowing it, begin a story just like this one.